Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. On the night of July 27, 1957, in a small town about an hour northwest of Montgomery, Alabama, Jimmy Wilson and Estelle Barker encountered one another in her bedroom. Now, that doesn't sound like the makings of a riveting crime of the century, but it will become one that made a mighty ripple through the world press at the time, and is now, on occasion, something law school students debate when they're asking themselves fundamental questions about race and American justice. Mr. Wilson, 53, was black, and Mrs. Barker, reported to be either 74 or 82, was white. What exactly occurred in that Marion, Alabama bedroom is and was known only to them. Suffice to say, they had different versions of that evening. Mrs. Barker testified that Mr. Wilson had done some yard work for her that day, something entirely understandable as Mrs. Barker was a widow, and she needed the occasional hand doing chores in the hot Alabama summer sun. Mr. Wilson had finished the tasks she'd given him, was paid for his work, and went home. He drank a bit. He later said he partook of some Wildcat whiskey, by which he meant moonshine, and if that weren't enough, he said the partaking was done with the wrong crowd. Inebriated, he decided he would return to ask Mrs. Barker if she had anything else he might do for her. He arrived and told her he was ready to do more work. She said it was too late for that. He then asked for some water, and she told him to go on outside and get some from the hose, as he had done before. Mr. Wilson, she said, then went outside, but came back inside through the back door, telling her straight out that he wanted some money. Whatever happened next in that room, no one could have imagined that it would prompt the international reaction that it did, involving the U.S. Secretary of State, multiple world leaders, an outcry from everyday folks from every corner of the globe. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Greenlight. Summertime is supposed to feel like a slower time of the year, isn't it? But man, that is not true this year. This summer's going by fast. My kiddo just finished summer camp. I swear he came back 3 inches taller, and he's only weeks away from starting middle school. I told him yesterday he's getting more and more independent, and that's a good thing. It's also where Greenlight can help. Greenlight is a debit card and money app made for families. Parents can send money to their kids and keep an eye on kids' spending and saving while kids and teens build money confidence and lifelong financial literacy skills. With the Greenlight app, kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely thanks to games that teach money skills in a fun, accessible way. The Greenlight app includes a chores feature where you can set up one-time or recurring chores, customized to your family's needs, and reward your kids with allowances for a job well done. I really could have used that as a kid, not only because it would have made me more agreeable when I was assigned chores, but also because I never learned how to do finances until I was a young adult, and those were some really expensive life lessons. Millions of parents and kids are learning about money on Greenlight. It's the easy, convenient way for parents to raise financially smart kids and families to navigate life together. Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/COTC. That's greenlight.com/COTC to try Greenlight for free, greenlight.com/COTC. Before we continue, a quick aside. In researching this story, I came across 2 spellings for Jimmy, one with a Y and one with an IE at the end, and 2 versions of Estelle's last name. It's either Baker or Barker. I think it's Barker because that's what newspapers reported at the time, and ancestry records back that up. But later writings tend to drop the R. I have no idea why. It could just be a mistake that was repeated over and over until the R's ceased to bother anyone. As such, we will stick with calling her Barker, and you don't have to worry about the spelling of Wilson's first name. It only lives to bother me. Back to that encounter in Mrs. Barker's bedroom. After Mr. Wilson asked if he could have money, Mrs. Barker told him she didn't have any, and he said she did. So she went back to her bedroom, got her purse, and dumped its contents onto the bed. Out spilled $3.95, and, she later explained to the jury hearing the case, he took most of it. Now, here is where her story significantly departs from his. She said that he then threw her on the bed, pulled off her underwear, and, quote, attempted to rape me. That's what he did, end quote. Mrs. Barker said that Mr. Wilson threatened to kill her if she moved when he placed his hands around her neck as if to choke her. Then, as if by act of God, a flash appeared outside which scared Mr. Wilson enough for him to jump up and, while running out the door, say that he would kill her if she didn't stay quiet about what had just occurred. There are a few versions of Mr. Wilson's story, but most were eventually revealed to have been proffered as the result of police threat and torture. Later, when talking with a Toronto newspaper reporter and thus without pressure to incriminate himself, Mr. Wilson said that yes, he had been drinking that day, but he had run out of money to continue to drink, and since Mrs. Barker had advanced him money in the past, he figured he'd ask her if she wouldn't mind doing it again. So he returned to the house to ask, and she said no. He left, and then said he got to thinking about that refusal and decided to go back and ask again. He said Mrs. Barker told him to come in, so he went in. He interrupted his narrative with the reporter to swear to God he wasn't lying about that. He was invited in, he emphasized. Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Barker then argued, yes, but soon he said she reached into her purse and threw whatever change she had on the bed. He figured it was something like $1.50 in change. He said he asked if she had more, and she said no, and that was that. The whole thing was pointless because he used the $1.50 to pay his taxi fare back home. He swore to the reporter that he never broke into her house, and he never touched her. Lord, yes, he should not have been drinking, he said. He was too old for that. But he did not do as she said he did, and it's worth noting he was never charged with doing it either. 2 days after the robbery, Mrs. Barker was asked to pick Mr. Wilson out of a 5-man lineup at the Perry County Jail, and she did. He was her yard man, after all. She knew well what he looked like. Later, when she was asked to identify him in the courtroom, she refused because she said she did not want to see his face. Mr. Wilson was charged with the crime of violent robbery. A correction on that. He was charged with a nighttime violent robbery, which, in Alabama at that time, carried a harsher potential penalty than if you had decided to demand someone else's money in broad daylight. I'm not sure why that mattered, but there you go. There was no criminal indictment for an attempted rape, which carried a maximum penalty of 20 years. It should be noted that was less than the nighttime robbery charge carried. Not sure what that says about the status of women in Alabama in 1957, but I digress. During the very brief trial, his lawyer, who was white, did not call any witnesses to help Mr. Wilson's cause. Neither did he think it necessary that Mr. Wilson tell his version of events. No one was called as a character witness. Maybe that was just as well. Wilson had been arrested 8 times between 1929 and 1957, having served 2 terms in prison for grand larceny. A less than upstanding citizen, maybe, but he was married and had been living in Marion since 1940, which meant he was not the drifter, as he was portrayed by some accounts. In fairness, he'd not been granted many advantages in his early life. From an episode of Death Row documentary,
Jimmy Wilson, a humble farmhand, was born into a world that deemed him less, purely on the basis of his skin color. Education wasn't an option for him, but he learned the hard lessons of life early on.
Wilson was illiterate, but he wasn't blind. He repeatedly told anyone who would listen that the crime actually did not take place at night. That when he left the Barker home, it was still light out, and it stayed light out for at least another hour and a half after. So it was not a night robbery. No one listened. Just as they had not listened when he tried to tell people he'd been beaten when questioned as investigators tried to get him to confess to any part of the alleged assault.
With no formal education to guide him, he pleaded not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity. However, in a twist of events, he later withdrew his insanity plea in open court.
The all-white jury took a little more than 4 hours to find him guilty of taking pocket change from Mrs. Barker. Then they sentenced him to die in the Alabama electric chair. You heard that correctly. Die. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Laundry Sauce. I just started a load of laundry with Laundry Sauce just a few minutes ago. I love this stuff. Seriously, there's something relaxing about pulling out fresh clothes that smell like Egyptian rose. That's my scent. If that's not your bag, you have plenty of scents to choose from. Australian sandalwood, cyber pine, Egyptian rose just happens to be my favorite. But there's more to like about Laundry Sauce than how it smells, and that includes the fact that it doesn't come in one of those big plastic jugs that just ends up in a landfill. Laundry Sauce was started back in 2021 by a team who were bored by the mundane scents in the detergent aisle, so they decided to make a product that was conscious, relevant, and innovative. And it's not just detergent pods. Laundry Sauce makes scent boosters, dryer sheets, dryer balls, and fabric softeners too. I usually don't even like scented detergents. This stuff is amazing. Remember, elevate your laundry with Laundry Sauce. Head to laundrysauce.com/COTC and use promo code COTC at checkout for 15% off. That's the best offer you'll find, but you must use my code COTC for 15% off your order. One last time, that's laundrysauce.com/COTC, promo code COTC for 15% off. This is Alabama in July 1957. Just 3 years earlier, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in its landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that segregation in America's public schools was unconstitutional. The famous line, "separate but equal is inherently unequal," rang through the nation, requiring action on the part of school boards everywhere. Folks in the South pretended not to hear them. Just 2 years earlier, in 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, triggering a massive citywide boycott of the bus system there. And in 1957, the Supreme Court reiterated its 1954 Brown dictate about school integration, demanding states, quote, use all deliberate speed, end quote, to get her done. No, they told Southerners, they were not kidding around. 1957 was also the year that Dr. Martin Luther King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to help organize the fight for civil rights throughout the nation. It was also the year that America took a bit of a diplomatic beating for something that became known as the Little Rock Nine. On September 4th, 1957, 9 black students enrolled in the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered the Arkansas National Guard to escort them safely into the school amid loud and angry protests that they be barred. But that's not what happened. The Arkansas governor decided this was a good time to defy the President of the United States. From a YouTube documentary by The Cold War.
With the Cold War underway, the propaganda machine had much grist to work with, especially as the civil rights movement grew and expanded. A perfect opportunity was taken advantage of in 1957 when Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus ordered the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School.
That was 2 months after Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Barker tangled in her bedroom, and 6 years before Alabama Governor George Wallace tried to stop 2 students from enrolling in the University of Alabama. While the world saw America's hypocrisy, many in the South didn't care what the world thought. They believed they were standing up for their way of life and the social caste system they believed was morally defensible. Mr. Wilson's crime, such as it was not just taking pocket change by force. His crime was being black in Alabama in 1957 and for choosing a white woman as his victim. He was sentenced to die for as much, even though no one else in Alabama had ever been required to do so for a theft of such a paltry amount, though it should be said that 4 men had been, by that time, executed for the crime of violent robbery in Alabama. All were black. Wilson's fate was not a big deal in Alabama, but it would shake the rest of the world.
Jimmy Wilson's case was more than a legal battle. It was a battle against racial injustice that had a profound impact on the civil rights movement.
Newspapers around the globe began referring to this as the death for a $1.95 case. A quick explainer, it made mighty compelling headline copy, but why $1.95? Mrs. Barker said it was $3.95, and Mr. Wilson originally said it was about $1.50. Well, later, he became precise. He told the Alabama Tribune that he got away with 3 50-cent pieces, 1 quarter, and 20 pennies. Yep, that's $1.95. I checked my math twice. Now, justice was quick back in the day. The crime happened in July 1957. Mr. Wilson was tried a year later. To say he had poor representation in court is an understatement, but it may not have mattered. As we all know by now, the death penalty was not equally meted out then or now. Brian Stevenson, Executive Director of the Equal Justice Institute.
Today and historically, race is the greatest predictor of who gets the death penalty in the United States. In Georgia, you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is a person of color. You're 22 times more likely to get the death penalty if the offender is black and the victim is white.
Death penalty judgments in Alabama in 1958 also invoked an automatic appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court. The court took little time in rejecting Wilson's request, noting for anyone who wondered, quote, "The amount taken is immaterial," end quote. By September 1958, Wilson's new lawyer filed a motion for a rehearing in front of the Alabama Supreme Court. That lawyer was the soon-to-be very famous civil rights attorney Fred Gray. He would go on to represent Rosa Parks in her cases against the segregation of Montgomery's bus system. He would also represent those who sought to march in Selma and fought for the rights of the 400 black Alabama sharecroppers who had been so badly lied to and used by the U.S. Public Health Service in their so-called 40-year study of men with syphilis. In reference to Wilson's case, Gray was referred to in Alabama's newspapers as being part of the quote-unquote outlaw NAACP. Gray's job in this case was not to change laws or battle discrimination. It was to get clemency for Wilson from Governor James Folsom, a man who had just been elected to the job and did not wish to upset the very opinionated constituency that had just agreed to put him in office. Though he had publicly made the statement that he would, quote, always grant clemency if he could find some excuse, end quote. So there was that. Except he had the chance to commute the death sentence of a 16-year-old black teenager from Montgomery named Jeremiah Reeves, who had been having a consensual relationship with a white female customer on his grocery delivery route. When they were discovered in the act, however, she said it was not consensual. Taken to Kilby Prison for questioning, Reeves was placed in the electric chair and told by police that he would be electrocuted if he did not confess to the rape. He did, but later recanted, to no avail. His trial took all of 2 days. An all-white jury took just 30 minutes to convict him and sentence him to death. The United States Supreme Court ordered a second trial, as the judge in the first trial had not allowed the jury to hear evidence of the torture Reeves had endured to get his confession. In the second trial, in June of 1955, he was found guilty again. Despite the efforts of Rosa Parks and Dr. King and the Montgomery NAACP, Folsom remained unmoved. Reeves was executed March 28, 1958. He was just 22. But I don't want you to come away from this episode thinking Jim Folsom was a dick. It's more complicated than that. In a University of Alabama-produced documentary, he was framed as an FDR-branded populist who wanted the best for all of those who lived in Alabama. He hadn't graduated college and was considered a political outsider, but his folksiness and understanding of the common man went far. All his life, he pushed for better pay for teachers, better roads, better old age pensions, higher taxes on the rich, and equal opportunity for the poor. Once he got elected, he made good on his promises. Here are snippets from the aforementioned University of Alabama-produced documentary on Big Jim Folsom.
Folsom immediately set about raising valuations on large landowners, calling special sessions of the legislature to demand a new constitution. In a statewide radio broadcast on Christmas Day, 1949, Folsom spoke out strongly for Negro political and economic rights, arguing that as long as blacks were held down, whites would be held down as well.
He was so far ahead of his time on the race question, you wonder how different Alabama would have been had a Jim Folsom-type governor been in office during the 60s instead of a Wallace-type governor.
Did this make Gray hopeful that Wilson would get clemency? It's hard to say. Emory University law professor and legal theorist Mary Dudziak wrote in the 2009 book, When the Law Fails, that, at some point, the Wilson case literally left Wilson behind. His case became about something else entirely. It was not, she argued, a case about what he did or did not do at Mrs. Barker's house, or what police did or did not do, or the lawyers or the Alabama Supreme Court. It became about saving face, specifically America's. Immediately after the Alabama Supremes chose not to grant his appeal, the nation's newspapers reported the development. Gray really didn't want the attention of the world. Sometimes that just entrenches sentiment against the attention getter. Gray was just trying to get the man a reprieve from his rapidly approaching September 4th death date. Then the world press got hold of the story, and the case took on significance no one could have predicted. As word spread about Jimmy Wilson's case, protests immediately popped up throughout the country. From Death Row documentary again.
The case drew national attention, igniting a firestorm of controversy. The disproportionate sentence for such a minor crime was seen as emblematic of the wider racial injustices that were rampant across the country. It became a rallying point for the civil rights movement, a symbol of the urgent need for change. Activists and advocates were galvanized, their resolve strengthened by the glaring injustice of Wilson's sentence.
Granted, the courts would have argued that this was not such a minor crime. Wilson had been accused of attempted rape, after all. But it's important to note that that's not what he'd been convicted of. His conviction was over the stealing of a pittance, even in 1957 money. Today, that amount would translate to a little more than $20. As divided as Americans were about the case, the real outrage came from abroad. It was not a secret that American racism was, and let's face it, still is, the Achilles heel when the gospel of American democracy tries to sell itself to foreign countries as a perfect system where any man can rise above his circumstances to become successful, prosperous, powerful. It was, and is, particularly difficult for diplomats to talk about human rights elsewhere when America still can't obliterate its racial divisiveness and get its open bigotry under control. As long as the Klan exists, as long as black men overpopulate American prisons, as long as George Floyds die in the streets at the hands of American law enforcement, foreign regimes can and do say, well, shut up. In 1958, the Cold War was real. Our way of life was always put in contrast to the Soviet way of life. Most aimed to depict America as a shining light compared to the darkness of oppression, inequality, racial cleansing, and apartheid so evident around the world. How this country treated its black citizens always seemed to put a bit of a lie to that. Jimmy Wilson was proof of that. To his supporters, his story reeked of hypocrisy on every level. White men in this era were routinely accused of raping black women, yet they were rarely investigated, much less arrested. See the Reese Taylor episode. Now imagine a white man stealing less than $2 from a black woman. Guilty or not, do you think he would have been sentenced to death? Of course not. The world noticed such disparities and took every opportunity to tell us how ridiculous we looked. The American Embassy in London received over 1,000 letters of protest, more than they had ever received on any American incident in years. The U.S. Consulate General in Toronto informed the State Department that Toronto papers were putting the story prominently on their front pages. As a result, leaders of the three political parties in the House of Commons there expressed, quote, deep concern about the fate of the Alabama Negro, end quote. House Leader Hazen Argue asked the Prime Minister to use Canada's great influence at all possible levels to prevent the sentence from being carried out. That was ruled to be out of order, meddling in the internal affairs of a foreign government would be improper. The Prime Minister responded to the request, but, nice idea. In Liberia, a headline read, American Negro may die for $1.95, to which the American Embassy there sent an immediate dispatch to the U.S. Department of State explaining, quote, that one small news item of the above type does considerable damage to the United States in this area of Africa, end quote. Then the government in Ghana informed the U.S. that it had been implored by its people to intercede, but would, of course, decline to. But still, they wanted the U.S. to know that Ghanaians were incensed by what they were reading and that the newspapers there had strongly reacted to the case, each emphasizing, quote, that the severity of the sentence can be accounted for only because Wilson is a Negro, end quote. Ghana's population is 98% Black Africans, though its demographics include many multi-ethnic communities. The ambassador to Ghana explained to the State Department in no uncertain terms that the goodwill that the U.S. had created in that country was about to be seriously compromised. The world piled on. More than 400 high schoolers in Switzerland sent the embassy there an expression of their shock over the case. Embassies began requesting guidance from the State Department about how to handle the inquiries that foreign citizens were making. University protests broke out in South America, Northern Europe, and the Middle East. Churches weighed in. Legal communities put their 2 cents in too. Newspaper editorials tried everything, begging, shaming, appealing to better angels, or comparing it to war crimes. Then the Alabama Supreme Court rejected a second request for a rehearing of Wilson's appeal, and, for the second time, it looked like Jimmy was done for. That brought new anger. In the Netherlands, the American ambassador's life was threatened if Wilson was electrocuted. Appeals were going directly to Eisenhower. No decent government neglected to chime in about the abomination taking place in the American South, something the President of the United States explained he could do nothing about. And an astonished Governor Jim Folsom sat in his office in Montgomery deluged with 1,000 pieces of mail a day, all of them telling him exactly what he had to do. The vast majority explained he had no choice but to commute Wilson's sentence. More than a few sent the governor money, $1.95 to be precise. And per the warning, the judicial situation in Alabama was, in fact, used as anti-American propaganda in the Soviet Union. All of this forced the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, to write a very careful telegram to the governor. It was a lengthy one. It read, quote, "In keeping with the function of the Department of State of reporting to officials in the United States information received through the Foreign Service of concern to them, I wish to make known to you that the United States diplomatic missions in a number of foreign countries have reported considerable reaction to the case of Jimmy Wilson, now pending in the Alabama courts. In transmitting this to you, I, of course, neither have the desire nor the intention of intruding upon the judicial processes of the state of Alabama or upon your responsibilities as governor of that state. In the United Kingdom, the embassy in London has received, within a period of 8 days, approximately 650 letters and telegrams protesting the death sentence or requesting information concerning the case. Many of the communications were from organizations such as schools, churches, and labor unions. A petition for clemency signed by 2,800 persons has also just been received at the embassy today." End quote. A paragraph then talked about what was happening in Ireland. Another explained what was happening in Trinidad and Jamaica. The next referenced Ghana's reaction. Another detailed the reaction in France, Belgium, and Germany. Yet another paragraph explained how Uruguay was talking to the United Nations about the case. On and on the telegram groaned. I don't know much about diplomacy, but this doesn't strike me as subtle pressure. It kind of reads like it was written on a velvet-wrapped sledgehammer. Governor Folsom sent a return telegram that basically said, "Yeah, you should read my mail, buddy." Except, he said it politely. Then he said as soon as the courts were done with Wilson, he would anticipate the request for clemency to come to his office, and he would act then. And so it happened. When attorney Fred Gray asked for a clemency hearing, Folsom said, quote, "I want to put an end to this international hullabaloo," end quote. That's a real quote, by the way. I triple-checked. A clemency hearing was arranged in short order. The state was represented by its Solicitor General, who predictably was incensed by the suggestion that Wilson would be allowed to live. He loudly and firmly objected to clemency for what he termed, quote, "the most vicious, horrendous, and contemptible crime man is capable of," end quote. He was referring to the attempted rape of Mrs. Barker, something for which Wilson was, I must remind, never charged with and never convicted of. And if it had happened and he had been convicted, the maximum sentence for it would have been 20 years in prison, not death. Gray then argued that Wilson had not received equal justice under the law, that if he had been white, they wouldn't be standing there. He beseeched Alabama not to be the scourge of the entire world and said its integrity and that of the United States needed to be protected. It was reported that Folsom then asked a few questions of Wilson, mostly about his early life. Then it was all over in less than a half hour. Folsom had some thinking to do, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he already knew what he had to do. An editorial in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat on September 26, 1958, was obviously written by a reporter or editor who had previously worked in Alabama and knew Governor Folsom personally. He addressed his words to him, again using some uncomfortable terminology that was common at the time. Quote, "If that colored man is electrocuted for stealing the sum of $1.95, the name of Alabama will stink as loudly at home as it will stink abroad, where our gallant red friends lay back and smack their lips in anticipation of just such a thing as the Wilson business. This is the kind of stuff that gets printed in Pravda and is choice fare to be blared all over the East via Radio Cairo. If Alabama wants to do its country a real disservice, all it has to do is burn this boy. Electrocute Wilson, and America will be broadly described in Russia, the Middle East, and in all satellite states as a land in which a peasant's life is worth the exact sum of $1.95, end quote. 3 days later, on September 29, 1958, a little less than a month before Wilson was set to die, Governor Folsom commuted Wilson's sentence. Under Alabama law, he had no authority to do more than reduce the sentence to life imprisonment. Quote, "It will be up to the Pardon Parole Board to see how long he has to serve," end quote. In his remarks following the announcement, though, Folsom acknowledged something no one expected him to. Quote, "I admit that we have got the worst penal system in the world, including Dark Africa. I hope the next legislature will do something about improving the situation," end quote. He then sent a telegram to Secretary of State Dulles to inform him personally about the decision. He said, quote, "knowing your interest," end quote. The reaction around the world was rapid and jubilant. Then a tad less so when people learned that Wilson's death sentence had been commuted to a life sentence, which, for many of those protesting the circumstances in Alabama, did not translate into a fair shake for Jimmy, given his crime. A few newspapers, organizations, and protesters congratulated themselves for helping to turn the tide on Wilson's date with the electric chair. The State Department gave embassies a lovely form letter to use to respond to inquiries about the case. They soon enough found that interest had dropped off and outrage had cooled. America's image got brushed up a bit by Governor Folsom, a man who was hailed in some parts of the world as a great humanitarian. Jimmy Wilson went back to a cell in Atmore State Prison, located an hour east of Mobile. Something Tom Yarborough of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote was, quote, "Rose, azalea, and camellia country along the Gulf," end quote. This time, instead of being on death row, he would work on the 5,000-acre prison farm for 8 hours a day, every day it wasn't raining, and be allowed to mingle with other, mostly black inmates during the day. Wilson told Yarborough he liked the work. It sure beats sitting in a cell by yourself all day. Wilson would have to serve at 15 years before he could seek parole. That was approved on October 1st, 1973. He was 70. He had very effectively faded from public view. He had not spoken to attorney Fred Gray since the day his clemency was granted. His case was not publicly brought up by civil rights leaders before or after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. There is no monument to his folly, or to his suffering, or to the fact that he once saved America's face. I couldn't even find his grave. To research this story, journalist Amy Wilson read Mary L. Dudziak's work in When Law Fails, Making Sense of Miscarriages of Justice, edited by Charles J. Ogletree Jr. and Austin Serrett. She read almost all of the coverage of the case from archived news reports from 1957, 1958, and 1959. She brushed up on her civil rights timeline with the help of numerous websites and documentaries. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben-Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating